Welcome to episode 17 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. Thank you for joining us today. The theme or the topic that we are planning to dive into today is the topic of micromanaging when it comes to movement. And we're like kind of based in the yoga world, our podcast is. So we're going to kind of look at micromanaging when it comes to movement in terms of teaching yoga. But of course, this is something that is equally relevant across many movement modalities, and we may touch on that as well. And I also think that you could think about micromanaging. So we're kind of thinking about it in terms of teaching and guiding other people through movement, but we could also think about it just in the sense of just ourselves as a mover and whether we're choosing to micromanage how we move, or if you're in a yoga class, you may micromanage your own movements, like aside from what you're being led and taught to do. So it kind of works at multi levels. Um, Micromanaging is a term that I'm pretty sure most of us are familiar with, but a technical definition of what micromanaging means is to micromanage is to control every part, however small, of an enterprise or activity. So I think the implication there is it's kind of like teaching movement or teaching yoga in a way in which the teacher is really trying to control every small detail of how their students move. I think that's a good way to kind of summarize micromanaging. And there is a trend in the yoga world and it's not in every yoga class and it's not every teaching style, but it's definitely a trend for yoga to be taught in a somewhat micromanaging manner. And so that's kind of what we wanted to address today. Micromanaging in general probably has I would suggest like a negative association for most of us. And just that term in general, if you think of micromanaging in the workplace, people don't generally use that term in a favorable way. So it's generally negative, but I believe that Travis and I don't necessarily think that teaching in a detailed manner is inherently negative or unhelpful. So we kind of wanted to take a look at that nuance today as well. So our plan for this chat is just to look at micromanaging, to look at some of the ways in which it might be unhelpful, but also to look at ways in which teaching at a detailed level may be helpful, like in what context that could actually be favorable. And then we want to just make all of that a little more concrete by kind of applying these ideas to a few really specific yoga pose or asana examples. So that's kind of the plan today. And Travis, I'm really glad you're here with me to talk about all of this.
Thanks for
I
that awesome intro. I'm
well,
even more excited about it now than I was before.
really?
Yeah, you
Thanks for
just
saying that.
sparked some ideas. So,
Wow, I'm really honored that you think so. And I know, like as I introduced, we're kind of rooted in maybe like a yoga lens in looking at this topic, but you're exercise science, strength and conditioning person. So do you see micromanaging in
yes.
in that realm?
Yes, absolutely. And it's I think similar in the way it manifests in a
Mm-hmm.
fitness context as what we'll talk about from a yoga context, but I could give some examples of how I've seen it and how it just like the difference between not micromanaging and micromanaging and how a person might experience their movement practice or their strength training practice as a result of that type of cueing.
That's great. I hope you do, yeah, contribute some insights from that. And I also like if there's the yoga world, if there's kind of more the strength and conditioning or fitness world, when it comes to movement, there's also like physical therapy or physiotherapy. And I feel like I've noticed also a trend in the physical therapy world for this topic to be brought up as well, as far as like how physical therapists might teach or administer exercises to their patients and how they could do that in a micromanaging way, or they might do that in a less micromanaging way, and when that's
Yeah,
appropriate and
it's
inappropriate.
interesting to think about because in a physical therapy or physiotherapy context, you're dealing with people who are injured or in pain, and there might be
Mm-hmm.
more of a reason why you would want to get into these nittier, grittier details. But
Mm-hmm.
it might be the case too that it's not just like in yoga and an exercise context, it might not be necessary. always at
Right.
least.
Right, totally. So yeah, so I feel like I see this aspect of teaching movement brought up in that realm as well. And I don't know, as long as we're throwing out yoga and then fitness and then physical therapy, like kind of all those realms of movement, as I was talking about that, I was just thinking that maybe we could think of like a fourth realm of movement practices, which is kind of the somatics-based movement side
Let's
of
just throw
things.
everybody under the bus.
No, I don't. I'm not bringing that up in terms of like throwing them under the
No,
bus.
I'm not. I'm teasing actually because I think when I think of somatics, I think that
Hmm.
like I think of somatics being characterized by this more nuanced and finer details of movement
Mm,
and
interesting.
reflection on that as you're going through that process. Which so you can do a yoga fitness rehab
Uh-huh.
session without micromanaging, but I don't know, or without getting into like the weeds of those finer details
Hmm.
of movement
Hmm.
potentially. But somatics, I think that that's part and parcel of that practice. Would you say?
I'm really glad you
Not
brought
from a
that up.
negative context, and we'll get into that. Like, well, how can you do? How do you do it right, and how do you do it wrong? But to me,
R-
that's what my limited understanding of somatics is, that it is a very detailed practice.
I think that's really brilliant that you observe that because I think you're totally right. In my experience with somatics, it certainly is kind of honing in on the fine tune elements of movement or how one can move. But I think the distinction, at least in my experience, is that in somatics, although it's a detailed way of teaching movement, it's much less about control from like the top down, and it's much less about right wrong ways of moving. In
Mm-hmm.
these detailed ways, it's more about paying attention to movement in a fine-tuned manner, but with like kind of a flipped emphasis, like you're just open to the possibilities you're experiencing,
Oh,
exploring.
well,
It's not
shoot.
about right or wrong.
That was the whole point
So
of
it's,
this.
oh, I know.
So we're done.
No,
We're
but
not done.
it
We're not
is
done.
it is a good way to pull
Keep
out and
listening.
just, I think what it does is it shows that micromanaging and teaching in a detailed manner, it's nuanced, right? And it's in certain contexts it can work well, and in others maybe not so well, but it's kind of all about how you're doing it and with what intention.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's interesting to think about like those four just general types of movement and how really these questions could be come up and be applied in all of those realms. It's all movement, but again, it's all movement, but in different contexts. So anyway, uh, maybe taking a closer look at just micromanaging in general and what that means and what that actually looks like, just so we all
Mm-hmm.
have a bit more of a concrete idea
Mm-hmm.
about what exactly this looks like. So, and since I'm like a yoga person and that's kind of my lens,
Yeah. Could I be the yoga student and you'll micromanage me through a pose or series of poses?
I love that. That yes, that's perfect.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, I'm the teacher, and I'm going to teach you a yoga pose from a very micromanaged perspective, or in a
Super.
micromanaged manner. So
I
let's
love being micromanaged.
you it can be nice and like again, it's not necessarily always unhelpful. You're really funny. At least if you feel like you don't know what to do, then being taught in a micromanaged way may make you feel like it's helping give you
It could give
guidance.
you some sense of safety, perhaps, but
Hmm.
maybe not. Maybe that's what you want, but maybe that's not what you need.
Right. That's an interesting way to look at it. So let's have you, I want you to come into plank pose. I want you to come into plank. So we're
Okay.
going to start by starting on hands and knees, like in a tabletop position. So first, you're in your tabletop position, and I'd like you to look down at your wrist creases. So, we've got your two hands down. Look at your wrist creases and the angles that those wrist creases are making, and you want to align them so that they're parallel with the front edge of your mat. So if you look down at the two wrist creases on both hands, it's like one horizontal line would line them up, right? So does that mean you need to like turn them out or turn them in a little bit? Can you picture that?
In my mind's eye, I just turned them out a little bit.
Right. I
Actually, I've
think
turned the right one out and the left one in.
Right. I think that I predict that most people do a little bit of turning out, but although you just said you did either on both, but anyway, you want to change where your hands naturally were so that you align with this like ideal horizontal line that I want you
Because
to
there's no
embody.
way that you just did it right in an okay way the first time.
No, you don't. Like, your body doesn't know how to move. I'm
Right.
here to tell you how to move.
Perfect. Thank
You're
you.
my student and you don't know how to move, so I'm telling you. So this
Perfect.
is how you embody hands and knees. So that's just the wrist, but then like let's look at the rest of your hand. Look at your fingers and make sure to spread them evenly apart. Like check that out. Like, is there more space between maybe
As
your ring
wide as I
finger?
can, or not necessarily.
Some well, okay. Some teachers would say as wide as you can, like flatten your hands out like a pancake. I'm probably gonna personally wouldn't like suggest that. Like that's a little extreme. I would just say make them even. Make those fingers even, from including the thumb. So they're even, and then look at the
Wait,
base knuckle.
might
Mm-hmm.
you come to my around to the students' mats and like inspect
Oh
in this
yeah,
case?
yeah. In some for sure. In some yoga
Okay,
settings, that would happen. I would come around and I would look, and then I would correct you.
good.
I'd be like, turn that
I
left
don't want
hand
to do it.
out a little
I don't want
more.
to do it wrong.
Right, exactly. So that's what I'm there to do. I'm there to teach you how to move your body because you don't know how. So, so that's that. Then we need to look at the hand in relation to the shoulder. So look at the base knuckle of your middle finger, like the not like the base knuckle, and make
Okay.
sure that that lines up. Like then trace a line up your arm and make sure that lines up with the center of the head of your humerus.
So
Because you don't want
get
it to
my
be.
X-ray glasses out.
Yes, exactly. So you could see your bones.
Yeah.
And you need a straight, basically you need a straight line. If I look at you from the front, from your center of your shoulder all the way down, through the base knuckle of
So
that
that's
middle
like a
finger.
hand width situation.
Yes, that's exactly why I'm teaching you that, because I want your hands to be exactly shoulder distance apart.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds safe. Like a good safe
Yeah,
position.
right. It's joint stacked, right? Joint stacked. Your
Yeah, I
shoulders
think we've
stacked right
talked
over
about
your.
that before.
Right. I think we
Maybe,
have. I
maybe.
can't remember which episode, but we certainly have. Yeah. It's very common in the yoga world, joint stacking, which is definitely, I feel like, an example of micromanaging, I think.
Perfect.
So I've micromanaged you a bunch already, like wrist,
Feels good.
fingers. It does. Good. And then I'm only going to do one more because you can see how this could go on really long and be really tedious. But here's just one more example. And we haven't even gotten into plank. This is all
Yeah, I'm
just
still in quadruped.
I know. I
Well,
know.
you got to get me to plank.
Well, you can't get to plank
That's
until
what
we
I
set
came
you
here
up.
for.
We
Okay.
have to set you up right.
Okay.
It has to be prepared. You can't just like jump into
Getting there
plank.
willy nilly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you can't do that. So, okay, last thing is we need to talk about your shoulder blades on the upper
Ooh.
back, your scapulas. So those are those like triangular bony plates on your upper back that your upper arm bone attaches into your shoulder blades, and those need to be in the correct position as well. So for plank pose, and this is some teachers will teach it differently, but I'll teach it the way that I see it the most. In plank pose, we want to make sure that your shoulder blades are in a position that's called protraction. So they need to be broad on your upper back. If you kind of like collapsed your chest toward the floor while you were in quadruped, so that your shoulder blades move toward each other, and there was like a valley between them, that would be retraction. That's what we don't want in plank. So I might even have you do that. I might have you retract and then protract, do the opposite, just so that you set your shoulder blades in the exact position I want them in for your plank. So can you feel that you did that?
Yep. They're all set now.
Okay, good. So you got all of that. Now you can go ahead and step back into plank pose.
Perfect.
And now I micromanage you all the way into this optimal ideal plank. It looks the way it should look from the yoga
Well, wait.
books. Yeah.
Did I maintain all of that stuff from the fingers to the shoulders
Yeah, you were
as
supposed
I
to.
stepped
Sorry if I
back?
didn't specify that. Yeah, you're supposed to
Well,
hold all of that.
I tried, but what if I didn't do such a hot job?
Like what happened? What changed?
Well, it's just hard as I moved, right?
Oh,
Like
you
as I
felt like you couldn't.
yeah, as I stepped back from quadruped to my plank, it's hard to keep the protraction and keep the whatever else,
Mm.
the
Mm-hmm.
finger separation and the,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
do I
I
have to
didn't even
start
talk.
over?
Yeah, you do actually, because you
Okay.
lost. Basically, the point is, and I also just want to say I forgot to even teach the elbow creases, and I guess
Yeah.
we'll do
Oh
that
my
now. But that's a
goodness.
whole other aspect of plank pose. Like, which way do the
I
elbow
knew I
creases
was missing
face?
something.
Yeah. We
So
should have layered that on too.
the elbow creases should face forward, right?
Yeah, and again, I see different people teach that different ways. It could be anywhere from 45 degrees to all the way forward, in my experience. But you definitely don't want the elbow creases facing each other. That's what you don't want.
Okay, got it. So halfway in between facing and forward or forward.
Yeah, that's my experience. Yeah, that would be the right.
Perfect.
So the point is, like, what I did was I set you up on hands and knees in this very controlled manner. Like, I had you override all of these ways that your body was naturally just positioning you there, right? Because you were naturally positioned in a less optimal way. We had to check all these boxes to get you optimized. And then you consciously, through this control, cognitive control from your brain down to your body, top down, you were supposed to embody that and then hold on to all of that as you step back to plank pose. And yeah, if you lose it, because it's likely that you would lose any number of all of those points, because that's a lot of conscious control you'd have to
Yeah,
keep.
how many things can you think about at one time?
That's a really good question. Sometimes I like to ask the micromanaging teaching style, that just like, how is that possible? Like, how much can you literally hold in your brain at once?
Let alone then when you add movement to it, or you change, something somewhere else in the body.
Totally. What if you step back to plank and then you go back to down dog and forward to plank and you do these like, forward and back? That's a lot of movement. And are you supposed to keep all of those points in check? Like, movement is complex, like so much moves whenever we change position. So I know, obviously, I mean, the way that I cued you into plank, that probably took, I don't know, like 5-10 minutes. That's certainly an exaggeration. And it doesn't really happen like that in a practical way in yoga classes. But
maybe it does some places.
In my experience, Iyengar yoga and also Anusara, which that's not really a style anymore. It's very much fallen out of favor, but Anusara is kind of in the tradition of, or influenced by Iyengar. Those two styles, to me, I don't think what I just did with you is that much different compared to what's commonly done. They're very alignment focused, like down to the detail like that. So do you think that kind of sets a good impression of what micromanaging might look like? In the yoga, it's like teaching down to all the way down to those details and layering on control.
Yeah, maybe you could give another example for like lower body. You don't have to take me through it for 5 minutes, but just to give one more.
Okay, one more. How about the pose Warrior One, Virabhadrasana?
I know that one.
Yeah, you do know that one. So let's say Warrior One. So we've got 1 foot forward, 1 foot back in kind of a lungy position, but then that back heel is grounded. So in Warrior One pose, it's really important that you are in it with your feet a certain distance apart. And again, this kind of varies, but like it at least needs to be. Sometimes I'll see like hip distance apart, but you definitely don't want your feet to be like on a tightrope or too narrow. That's bad.
And that it's going to be the same for everybody.
Yeah, everybody should place their feet. I don't know what it is, 8 inches apart, like some objective distance. But you're right, everybody,
because everybody's the same.
Yeah, all the bodies are the same. They all move in the same optimized manner. So Warrior One always has the same foot width. That's the same for everyone. And then the back foot always has to angle forward for everybody the same degree.
And that
meaning that I also find ranges a little, but I'd say 30 to 45 degrees generally.
Now, are you opening up the protractor app on your phone and like bringing it to each student? And
I could see that potentially happening, maybe in like a workshop setting, like a yoga workshop where we're breaking everything down. And I mean,
where this might actually make sense. Maybe.
Right. Like we're actually teaching. Yeah. Maybe not so much in like a lead everyday class would we whip out the protractor.
Okay.
But that's the idea, that back foot angling forward, meaning as opposed to the toes pointing straight out to the side, like that would be 0 degrees. So then it's like, what degree forward do the toes start to point? So 30 to 45 degrees. And then the front knee, let's talk about the front leg in Warrior One now. Like we definitely don't want that front knee forward of the ankle.
Oh,
And
geez.
we also we also don't want it behind, like you don't want it too high. The correct position for the warrior one front leg is that front knee is directly above the ankle and the angle of the knee is 90 degrees. That would be correct. So
I've
you
been
need to
doing it
find that
wrong
in
this
your
whole
body.
time.
Have you been doing it more or less than 90?
Uh, Higher than 90.
Oh, so you've kind of been like in a shallower warrior one.
Yeah. So I obviously haven't had good teachers.
I guess not. You've been doing it wrong. That's why you need
Hmm.
me, your
Yeah.
micromanaging yoga
Good thing
teacher.
we're here.
I mean, there's so much more. It's a whole body pose, as all of our yoga poses are. We could talk about the shoulders, the arms, the spine. Like there's so much for every pose you could really break down.
Hmm.
But do you think that's a good enough way to?
Yeah, I think that's sufficient.
Okay, yeah. So that's how we see this tendency to micromanage kind of manifest in the yoga world. To more and lesser degrees, of course, we're being a little extreme in these examples to get the point across.
Hmm. So why do we do that? Why do yoga teachers
That's a really good question.
go to such extremes?
Right, right. Well, I think one reason may be kind of what we alluded to a little earlier as we were role playing, which is the idea that yoga students don't really know how to move their bodies, and they need an authority or an expert like the yoga teacher to tell them how to move their bodies correctly.
Hmm.
I feel like I see that parallel kind of in other movement modalities as well. Like
Yeah,
maybe, like this kind of
totally.
common. Yeah. You need this like expert in movement to teach you how to move your body better or optimally.
Yeah, and that can sometimes be true to some extent,
Hmm. Right.
um, especially when we're talking, from a strength training standpoint. There are sometimes more optimal ways to do things when working with heavy loads
Right. That's a
from a
really good point.
safety standpoint. I, I,
Hmm.
s- I, I'm a little more skeptical of it in a body weight yoga context.
Mm.
I mean, certain poses are higher load even with just your body weight, and there are
Hmm.
potentially safer ways to go about it. But pretty much everything that you just described, I don't see much injury risk for not executing those poses at those joints with those exact specifications.
Right. Thank you for saying that. When I think about those examples as well, we're talking the arms in quadruped or plank, and then the lower body in warrior one. That all seems relatively low load, right?
Yeah. So there could be situations where, yeah, you do want to make sure that your students are safe because the loads in those positions could be better directed or distributed with a given alignment. But in the context that we just described, that would not be the case.
Hmm.
I think
And
it's
that, but
just
that,
like just about any way that anybody would do those things would probably be just okay. Which is to
oh,
say that for you to say, oh, well, the students don't know how to move naturally, so they need to be, molded into this shape. It's like, for that stuff, who cares if your hands are
right.
like not perfectly parallel and there's more space between your index finger and your middle finger than your middle finger and your ring finger, or elbows are not
Right.
as far rotated forward, or shoulders are neutral instead of protracted, or I'm a little bit
Hmm.
higher in my warrior one than 90 degrees.
Hmm.
There might be that whatever the person naturally does might be just what feels right to them,
Right.
or
Right.
might be what their body is naturally organizing into for a
Hmm.
reason.
Hmm.
So we could maybe try to experiment with some different things, but we could also just let it be.
I love that. Thank you so much for pointing that out. So it sounds to me like when we're saying that one reason people micromanage is that there's kind of a belief that people don't naturally just know how to move their bodies well. That's also tied into the idea that teaching with these very specific alignment cues is protective against injury and pain.
Right. Yeah,
Those two are kind of connected, right? It's kind of the same.
exactly.
Yeah, so people they just willy-nilly move around and it's not safe, and they need to learn how to align so that it's safe. But it sounds to me like what you're suggesting is in many, if not most, of the contexts that we're talking about in a bodyweight yoga practice, there probably isn't that much risk of like you said, you could do plank with your hands in many variations, and those are just variations. It's not necessarily safer or less safe.
Yeah, and in some fitness contexts, they would maybe plank's not the best example, but push up or chaturanga would be a situation
Hmm.
where you, in a fitness context, would be there would be options. You could have your hands wide, you could have them narrow, you could have them farther from your feet, you could have them closer to your feet, you could have them asymmetrical. You could do the plank in protraction or neutral. Like there, it would be more option based as a maybe as a way to make it more challenging, or just change the challenge, just give
Hmm.
add
Hmm.
variety if
Hmm.
anything, as opposed to one right way.
Absolutely. That's also, I mean, so basically you're saying in the fitness world, they're intentionally created different variations of something like a push-up, whereas in the yoga world, chaturanga is a pose that tends to be taught like it needs to be done this one exact way always in order to avoid injury or whatever. But you're saying in the fitness world, there are a bunch of different variations of a push-up. And people do a lot of push-ups at once. Like you do a set of, I don't know how many 10 per set or whatever in a row, and you might do 3 to 4 sets. Like that's a lot of push-ups to do in these different variations, hands together, hands wide, blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
But it sounds like they don't really worry about it in the fitness world.
Not they're not worrying about saying, oh, this is the one right way to do it. there
Right.
there could still be execution cues with each of those, which could sometimes get into some of the things that we've talked about. But just the point would be that there's no one setup, because like you could take any of
Mhm.
those quote unquote mistakes, from a yoga chaturanga, and that would be a desirable variation from a fitness context.
That's right. I love how when we compare movement modalities, we can see like similarities and differences in what we might have to learn when comparing. Like maybe it doesn't have to be so like one right way in the yoga world, at least as far as like injury and pain goes. But if you're talking about other reasons people micromanage, like another reason is just because that's the shape of the pose, like that's the final, that's what the aesthetic of the pose is supposed to look like. If you look in the yoga books, warrior one looks like this, that front knee is at 90, that back foot angles forward exactly this. And so it's just like we teach it that way because that's the pose.
So somebody said so a while ago.
Yeah, exactly. And I might suggest that you can probably get most people into a rough approximation of the shape of a pose without necessarily needing to go all the way down to those fine-tuned details as well. But that just may be another reason that people do micromanage if we're talking about why.
Mhm.
Now, I feel like we've already kind of been alluding quite a bit to some of the drawbacks of teaching in a micromanaging manner. But yeah, what were we going to say?
One more thing about so we talked about avoiding injury, but
Yeah.
another related concept would be avoiding pain. And
Yeah.
so
Thanks
that
for
would
pointing that
be
out.
some of the other, warnings I think that a yoga teacher might give. Okay, make sure that you corkscrew your elbows, or turn the eye of your elbow forward, because it's going to be safer. But that's still maybe injury. You're less likely to develop shoulder pain if you do it X or Y way, or do it Y instead of X way. And that's a really slippery slope, and
Right.
probably not like probably wrong, and probably, you just can't say something with that much confidence about an alignment based cue. So, subtle difference
Right.
between, oh, you're going to get injured versus you're going to have pain, just because pain and injury are a little different. And I think we talked about that before too.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. Yeah, I think we talked about this maybe in our episode on injury. Can we prevent injuries in yoga?
Right.
And I guess that was injury focused, but we did talk a bit about how there is a distinction between injury and pain.
Yeah.
And yeah,
So either way, we're talking like good green check mark or bad red
yeah,
X. But the reason why could be, oh, we're trying to prevent injury in the moment, or we're trying to prevent pain that might develop over time if you do it this way or that way. And the point being that we probably shouldn't be as certain about those cues as we maybe are, just because pain is so complicated, and it's probably not just one thing that's making your shoulder hurt.
Precisely. And
but if your shoulder does hurt,
yeah, that's
then it's a
actually
different situation, in which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Right, exactly. Which is if you have an acute shoulder pain in the moment, that might be a little different than you're pain free and the teacher is talking about you need to align this way in order to avoid pain in the future. We're not fortune tellers, and like you said, pain is just so complex and multifactorial. So how can we ever really know that and pull out one factor and then say that's going to cause this in the future? It seems pretty unlikely. So we kind of have we've kind of covered why the draw to micromanage. Maybe we'll think of another reason we'll throw out there.
Maybe another reason would just be like power trip. How do you say that in a little bit of a nicer way?
That was at the tip of my tongue. I was going to say control.
There you go. That's better.
Like that the yoga teacher has control, right? Like they're in charge. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah. Well, I guess two things. One way it could be a little bit more favorable would just be the teacher thinks that that's what the students expect. So they're trying to just satisfy the expectation that the students are going to come in there. Teacher is really smart. Teacher knows best. Teacher is going to teach me all of these nuanced things about these poses, and it's going to make for a better practice for me as the student. So that's one thing. But then also the teacher might just be showing off or something related to, let me show how much I know about the fine details of the poses. And maybe the students do or don't care.
That's such a good
that's
point.
Not what maybe that is or what isn't what they're there for.
No, you're so right. I mean, I guess I feel like showing that you have this knowledge about the best way for people to move their bodies does kind of set you as the teacher apart, like up on a higher level, like you're the authority in that situation. There is a power dynamic, and we kind of reaffirm that by continuing to be the one that directs and guides how other people move their body in that kind of controlling manner. Yeah.
For better or worse.
Exactly. And I think we'll talk in this conversation about how like a yoga teacher can certainly guide and teach and use cues and guide people through movement, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in that same way where like I'm telling you what's right. But I totally think that's part of it. That was at the tip of my tongue too. So like we've kind of gone over some of these, or we've implied some of this already, but just to be really concrete about it, specifically, why is micromanaging in a yoga movement context? Why is it unhelpful? Why is it limiting? Maybe we could just kind of quickly.
So the one that I alluded to before was just the idea that there really isn't necessarily a right or wrong way to move, and oftentimes people's bodies will self-organize or self-select the shape that is going to work best for them. And related to that, so that there may not be a right or wrong way, and people might figure it out on their own. And if you do micromanage, then you might create the belief that there is a right, or you might reinforce that idea that there is a right and wrong way, which can be a slippery slope.
Right. Like perhaps students might internalize that and take that idea with them off the yoga mat into their daily life.
Yeah.
And then think that they need to micromanage how they move their body off the mat all day.
Yes, exactly. And I think some teachers that might be their goal.
I think you're right. Yeah. When we get into there's those blurring the lines, I feel like, between a yoga teacher being a movement teacher versus a yoga teacher being some shade of healthcare practitioner or a pain professional or something like that. I don't know if that's what you're implying, but like, when you
that could be part of it, but just the idea of like, I'm going to teach you this right way to move on the mat, and then you're going to carry it with you throughout your day.
Yeah.
Because this is the right way to move.
I definitely think that happens.
Not just this is the right way to perform this pose, because that's how it is in the book. but this is the right way to move in general,
Yeah.
and make sure that you keep this, keep all of these things in
Hmm.
mind, all of these 800 things in mind as you're going about your day to day.
Absolutely. I think you're very right about that. I think that that can happen. That seems to me to be a plausible thing that can happen is as yoga students can pick up these ideas and then it's ultimately, of course, there's some individual contexts in which maybe it serves someone to micromanage, maybe temporarily, maybe they're working around pain or an injury and they do need to like think about how they move for a temporary time until it's better. But in general, by and large, we don't need to be micromanaging our movements off the mat. Like we can kind of just, move the way our nervous
Yeah,
system
we
wants.
on or off the mat, but especially off the
Yes,
mat.
on or
You
off the
can,
mat.
if you want to manage, micromanage or be micromanaged on the mat, like, and that's your prerogative, great. But
Hmm. Hmm.
it doesn't necessarily need to carry with you off the mat.
Exactly. Exactly. So one of the drawbacks of teaching in that style is that it can influence people to then move that way in general. And it seems like when one micromanages, what they're generally doing is we're overriding the way that our nervous system naturally wants to move our body. So we're just kind of interfering with what would otherwise be, you would think it would otherwise be smooth and efficient movement that would just naturally take place as you move your body through life. Or if we're talking on the mat, of course, there are some containers, like you're moving into down dog. That's a shape that we're all moving into, but people can still move with a little more freedom within the constraint or the context of that shape, or they can move with less if the teacher's like overlaying all of these cues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it just seems like micromanaging, one of the reasons it's unhelpful is I think it can create less efficient movement and interfere with just like the
Yeah,
natural way there. Do you think
I think so too.
it can overcomplicate movement?
Yeah, I think we clearly demonstrated that in our examples when it took 5 minutes
Totally.
to step back from tabletop or quadruped to plank.
Exactly. And like you
And
mentioned, mhm.
if I were a newer yoga student and
Yeah.
you were throwing all that at me, I would just be like, I just wanted to get here and here and move around and like get some exposure to this cool movement practice that I heard about. And then like I wasn't even allowed to step back into plank because I couldn't figure out how to get my elbows pointing forward or whatever. That's a
Hmm.
unnecessary barrier and potentially going to turn some people away. Like some
So,
people might, some more experience. Well, everybody's different. Maybe some newbies would
hmm,
enjoy the that aspect of it because they would, like I said originally, they might feel safer. They might feel
right.
like, oh, I'm getting such good guidance, I'm moving, because they come into it thinking that they need to move a certain right way.
Hmm.
And then some people might, some more experienced practitioners might come from previous experiences where they didn't get a lot of detailed or nuanced cueing. So then to come into that, they might crave that, like, oh, I really want to perfect my alignment, right? For whatever reason, so that
Hmm.
they look more like
Hmm.
the book, or they think that they get more out of it, or feel new things, or whatever, which is fine, like I said, but it we, like we mentioned before, it can lead to those kind of, can lead down the wrong path to then people thinking that there's only one right way, um,
Hmm.
or they're destined for injury if they don't do it that one right way, uh, and so it's, we'll talk about this more, but it's like what what is the narrative surrounding it in terms of,
Hmm.
okay, you can practice with this more nuanced approach joint by joint, because with the right intentions, from an
Hmm.
exploration
Hmm.
standpoint, or you can give all the same cues more or less, but it can have that kind of negative tailspin to it.
Totally. That I think that's so true. That yeah, we could be detailed in the way that we move our body, but just in a different context with a different like presentation or story around it, and it can have totally different effects.
Mm-hmm. So going, what, like the last thing you said about efficiency,
Yeah.
this is actually really well understood from a motor control standpoint, or motor
Hmm.
learning, or and motor performance too. So when you coach people too much into the weeds, their performance deteriorates. So if they're thinking
Right.
about too much or too many things or too internally focused on what their muscles are doing or how their joints are moving or how things are feeling, that can remove, like, that would be the opposite of what you need for high performance, which is usually more of an automatic process where, okay, you've taken the time to fine tune things previously, and now you've practiced to the point where it's become automatic. And that's going to allow you to execute the movements more fluidly and more accurately and for a
Mm-hmm.
higher, like with better performance.
And this
That's
is,
usually applied to like a sporting context. Like
mm-hmm.
a good example of that would be shooting free throws in basketball.
Yeah.
You would not want to micromanage someone through that process, or have them be overly focused on what their wrist is doing or what
Mm-hmm.
their whatever.
Elbow, shoulder.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's I've come across this example a couple of times. So if you're playing tennis and your
Mm-hmm.
opponent hits a nice serve and you say, "Hey, what did you do with your wrist on that one? That was a really good serve." Then the next time they're like, "What did I do with my wrist on that one?" And they start thinking about their wrist. And that can throw them off because
Throws
they
them
weren't thinking
off.
about their wrist before. They were just thinking about putting the ball in a particular spot or like placing the ball during the
Yes.
serve.
Over the
So
net and in that spot.
yeah. So anyway, the whole point is that when you micromanage, you can reduce the efficiency. And maybe that, again, maybe that's desirable because maybe you're not in need or wanting a very, maybe you're purposely introducing less efficiency because you're
Right.
trying to,
Imp-
you're, I don't know, you're trying to improve some of those, you're, whatever the reason is, maybe you can think of something,
yeah. I think,
but in
yeah.
general, maybe that wouldn't be what you want.
I think you're especially it all comes down to like what your goal is, right? And yeah, like efficiency and performance, especially in athletic context, it just makes a lot of sense that you don't want to bog people down by like having them consciously interfere with these otherwise pretty self-organized and automatic movements.
Mm-hmm.
And then a final point for how micromanaging can be unhelpful. And we're not going to get into this too much in this episode because we have an upcoming episode that will talk about this more. But micromanaging specifically with the idea that holding your body in these specific alignments will prevent pain or prevent injury, that can lead to something called a nocebo, right? And a nocebo is like the opposite of a placebo. And basically, a nocebo is negative expectations of an otherwise harmless event, and that resulting in negative consequences like pain. So, if you're told that something can cause pain, and then that creates a negative expectation for you about that movement, but if that movement or whatever it is was otherwise harmless and isn't actually something that's known to do that, then just the sheer fact of you creating those negative expectations could be something that in the future may contribute to you feeling pain because, as we know, pain is complex and has many factors that go into it. So it just seems like if you teach yoga with a lot of these cueing around, like align your body in this specific manner in order to protect, your joints, protect your shoulder, your hip, whatever, that could potentially, it seems like there's a mechanism there for how that could influence the nocebo effect in students. And I'm sure it's really dependent and it's not like a hard and fast rule, but it doesn't seem the best to me in terms of that, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that outside of some physical therapy contexts where I hear that discussed, at least that's where I learned about it. I don't think that's widely. I don't think people widely know about that.
The nocebo
Um,
effect.
yes, and so I think it's important that. Well, we're going to
Yeah.
talk about it more in an
Yeah,
upcoming episode, and I think that it needs to be talked about more because I think that
totally.
it can be very problematic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that. So I think it's good we're going to plant this seed. And maybe some of our listeners have not heard of nocebo before. It's a great topic to know about. It kind of opens the doorway into a lot of understanding about pain
Yeah.
science and all of
It
this.
sounds
But
like a made up word, but well,
it's a
I guess every word was made up at one point, but it's a real word.
Yeah. We didn't. Yeah, totally. It's, you can look it
Jenny
up.
didn't
It's a
make it up.
thing.
We didn't make it up. Yeah.
No, that definition
The
I gave for it is like the definition.
Yeah. The one other thing, and I think we touched on this or danced around it, is the idea of creating dependence
Oh yeah,
within a student.
on the teacher.
So yeah, and this is, well, there are so many examples of this in related contexts, but just the idea of like, well, I can't move without, like, I
Mhm.
need the teacher to watch me to make sure that I'm moving
Yes.
correctly,
Oh my
because they
gosh.
told me that I was doing it wrong before, and I'm really worried now, and I'm not comfortable moving on my own without my teacher's eye to let me know that it's okay. And
Oh, so true.
that's no
That's
good. That
not
now
positive.
you've created a barrier to movement where somebody can only move during a yoga class where they know they have eyes on them, and
Yeah,
that just isn't necessary.
it's like the opposite of helping foster someone's like sense of agency,
Right.
or like empowering them in their body. Like they can move their body and listen to their body and let that
Yeah.
drive
So
them.
yeah,
It's
so that
yeah,
that would be the other thing, is if we allow people to move authentically and naturally and encourage them when they're doing so, that builds confidence and comfort, and to the point where maybe they could practice yoga on their own
on
at
their
home if they can't
own.
make it to yoga class.
Exactly.
And now they're going to have more opportunities to move and
Mm-hmm.
just have experience that without the necessarily needing to go and be in class. And it just gives people more options and
A hundred
more
percent.
confidence and all that stuff.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah. So like that micromanaging leading to a sense of codependency,
Mm-hmm.
and the opposite of like, yeah, giving people agency over their own
Yeah.
bodies.
Another classic example of this would be in a physical therapy context
Oh
where the
yeah.
physical therapist is adopting or portraying themselves as a fixer, and they're
Yeah.
fixing you, and you can own they have magic hands, they are the only ones who can, they have the key to unlocking your pain. And
Resetting your, realigning you, whatever.
yeah,
Releasing your trigger points, whatever.
right. And so they, you, if you're in pain, they're the only person who can help you, as opposed to you being able to help
Right.
yourself. And again, just like we're going to talk about with the cueing, you can give all the same cues without creating that. You could do all the same, many of the same, at least, techniques from a rehabilitation standpoint, but frame it as the person
Hmm.
having their own keys to unlocking their pain, and you're just guiding or facilitating or whatever, so that you don't create that dependence, so that they don't feel like they need you anytime something's bothering them.
100%.
And
And I
I
think
guess the
mhm.
same in a fitness context, where the fitness instructor, personal trainer, coach, whatever, has the secrets or the keys or the information that you need to improve your fitness. And instead of like giving you all of the information, they withhold, or they just
Mm,
make you feel like you need them to get to where you want to go. Versus my approach would be, I'm going to try to teach my clients, my athletes, everything that I know, or impart as much wisdom as I can, so that they don't need me anymore. Like, that's my ultimate goal.
totally.
And then if they
Yep.
wanted to continue working with me, it would only be because they enjoy my,
Your
you know,
programming,
yeah,
your
but
personalization.
yeah, or just like hanging out or interacting. But they, like if I could no longer work with them, they would have all of the tools in their own toolbox to continue forward.
Absolutely. That's such a great way to empower them and not necessarily create this like dependent sense of dependency on you. Your clients are
Mm-hmm.
super lucky.
Oh, thanks.
But I think that's a great parallel. And I think something that you mentioned a little bit ago about how, like, in a physical therapy context, we can use, or not we, I'm not, but they can use like these same techniques in a way that could create codependency and rob people of agency, or they could use the exact same techniques, but it's how they, the context in which they use it, and then it could be have a totally different effect. I think that plays into micromanaging and teaching in a really detailed manner as well. And that could maybe lead us into talking about, and we could just briefly touch on some of these points, how teaching yoga students or movement students in a detailed manner, that actually could be helpful. We've spent a lot of time in this episode talking about how it's not so helpful, but how could we actually do the same thing? Like from the outside, it looks the same. You're still cueing in these very detailed ways and bringing people's awareness and attention to these small bits of alignment and movement. How could that be done in a way that actually was helpful? Like it's not, is it necessarily always bad? I don't think we think that, right?
Definitely not. I mean,
Right.
I definitely think it's not always bad.
Right, exactly. So maybe what micromanaging is, like the technical definition of micromanaging is like controlling every aspect of the task or whatever, no matter how small. I feel like it's that word control that kind of sets it apart. I think we maybe can agree that when we micromanage by that definition, that's probably not good in general. I can't really think of how that could be good, but we could still teach in a detailed manner, but then that's not micromanaging if we take out that element of control. Do you know what I mean? Am I making
I
that kind
do
of
know what
clear?
you mean. Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's what we're
So how do
talking
we do
about
that?
now. Yeah, how do we do that? Well, there are a lot of ways. I think maybe if we go back to just something like just like the cues I gave you for quadruped in order to go
Yeah,
into
yeah,
plank.
yeah.
Again, those were very extreme, and I don't think we would suggest anybody really do that. But as far as like having someone pay attention to their alignment, one way that actually teaching in a detailed manner could be helpful is what if the yoga teacher has a specific intention for loading a specific tissue or attempting to try to strengthen a specific tissue, right? In that case, it actually does matter how someone aligns their body, right? And so maybe asking for some attention to detail, maybe not necessarily all those things that I said, but some attention to detail so that you can align the person's body so that the loads that are applied in the pose actually target and load the tissues of interest.
Yeah, but probably not framing it as if you do it this way, then this bad thing will happen, but more from the
Hmm.
lines of where do you feel it? Oh, I
Yeah.
feel it in my eyeball. Oh, I want you to feel it in your shoulder. Well, try this or explore this. Eyeball.
Yes.
That was a terrible example. Maybe maybe they feel it
Just
in
somewhere way
their
off.
somewhere way off. Yeah, maybe they're feeling it like in an uncomfortable way in a particular
Hmm.
joint, and you're trying to direct the loads to more to like a muscular
Yeah, or what if it's an
aspect.
example of like bridge pose, but teaching bridge pose with the intention of getting the glutes to fire, of targeting the glutes, like a what would be called a glute bridge in a fitness sense.
Mm-hmm.
If you're teaching someone a glute bridge and if they tell you that they feel it in their back,
Yes.
it's not necessarily that it's bad or injurious that they feel it on their back, but it probably means they're working in their back. And maybe we really want to just direct the loads primarily to the glutes, right? So in
Yes.
order to do that, we would actually, I mean, you could, I guess I wouldn't call it micromanage because that's, the negative element, but we would in a detailed manner change their alignment or teach them how to change their alignment so they could
Yeah.
direct the loads, right?
Offer them some alternatives.
Right.
Hey, try this. How does that feel? Dorsiflex your
Exactly.
ankles, um, posteriorly pelvic tilt, engage your
Mm-hmm.
abs, drive through the heels, whatever, push your knees out, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But from an exploration sense, not from well, you're doing it wrong. You're going to hurt your
Right.
back. Do it this way. Just like, try this. How does that
Exactly.
feel?
Yeah. Like in that moment, for whatever reason, if you had the goal of them getting into their glutes, like firing their glutes, well, not firing, but activating their glutes, working their glutes, then if they're not feeling it there, then yeah, you can use some different options to help them find that. Or if we're thinking about quadruped, back on hands and knees, and the way the elbow creases are facing, remember that example? And we're like generally we're taught they should be 45 degrees or forward, something like that. So as far as teaching that as like in a micromanaging way, that's probably not so great. But what if the teacher had like a mobility drill in mind for shoulder rotation? In that case, they may have someone in quadruped
Ooh.
and have them intentionally take the eyes of the elbows all the way forward, like to their end range. And then with control, rotate them all the way till they face each other and maybe even a little further back. It depends on what their range is. But they just go
Ooh,
forward and back with their arms straight and their hands down to rotate at the glenohumeral joint, the shoulder joint, through a full range. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's wonderful. And I think that we're even telling them to explore the
Mm-hmm.
aspect of the or the alignment that we would traditionally say put the red X on top of. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's okay,
Totally.
right? Let's explore
Mm-hmm.
that. How does that feel? Let's explore the opposite. How does that feel? Okay, now choose the spot that feels best to you.
That's perfect. So I was using the rotating as like a mobility drill example,
Yeah.
but you're using it in even a cooler way, which is like for exploration, so people feel how it feels in their body, and then they choose for themselves the alignment they want to take.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what yeah? So we can like with awareness lead people through movements and notice their alignment, but have them feel their own body so they can settle on what feels right for them. So
I
that's a
like
good,
that.
so yeah. So in that sense, that's the teacher using the details of movement and the details of alignment. They're still teaching maybe in a detailed manner, but the context, the reason, the intention isn't correct, incorrect. It's like, let's help you learn about your own body and how
Yeah.
things
And
feel.
not that like I know what's right and wrong for you or for everyone, but like
Mm-hmm.
you're the expert in your own body. You try it both ways
Exactly.
and then figure out like decide for yourself.
Totally. So as the teacher, we're like guiding students in learning more about their body rather than telling them like in this power dynamic, like we know what's best for you and this is how you should do it. Right?
Yeah,
And you
totally.
can use details. You can teach in a detailed manner, sometimes to facilitate that, but you can also not use details and still try to facilitate
And
that.
maybe
But
you could even go the other way, which would be to be like where we just said, okay, elbows all the way in, elbows all the way out. Where do you feel it here? Where do you feel it there? But you could say, okay, um, we're trying to direct the. Maybe this is a better example for the glute bridge. We're trying
mhm.
to direct the loads to the glutes in this pose. Um, Try a few different things and see like you find the
Mhm.
things, and maybe this is more of like a
Right?
one-on-one or private session thing, but you tried a few different things and you tell me what seems to shift the loads to different places. Like what
I
can you
love
think of?
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like feet wide. Try your feet wide, try your feet narrow, try your feet more forward, try your feet more back, all these
Yeah.
different.
Yeah,
And
not to
then
say
what do you
like, oh well,
feel?
yeah, don't even tell them like, well, this way does one thing and this way does the
Mhm,
other. It's just like,
mhm.
well, what do you feel? And and that's better too, because like what like okay, biomechanically, yeah, maybe I think
There is
dorsiflexing
a
the ankles will do that for you, but everybody's different. So like if I tell
right.
you this, you'd be like, oh yeah, I feel that. But I would rather you tell me what you feel without me trying to, or without me guiding you or leading you in one direction.
I love that. I totally agree. And I think too, to keep for all of us to keep in mind that in a yoga context, which is like body weight and like it's a little, of course there is some strengthening that could happen in a yoga context, but it's not the same thing as a strength training practice, like in a but off the mat. So in general, I would suggest that a yoga practice is in general probably less about needing to build strength in certain ways and more about just like exploring and movement and mobility and things like that. So it seems to me if those types of goals are your goals, that especially those types of cues, what do you feel in your body? Let's be more exploratory about all of this, and you'll learn more about your body, and then you can, in an empowered way, position how it feels best to you. That seems to be especially appropriate for something like yoga versus maybe like like a strength and conditioning context where I'm doing bicep curls. I'm really trying to target the biceps, so I need to do it this way or something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
It's just
And
yeah.
I think there's a lot of inherent safety built into just having a body weight practice, where
Hmm.
you really do have the opportunity to explore with minimal with low risk
Mm,
for adverse events.
totally, totally. So it seems to me like that's playing a much bigger role in something like a yoga practice, potentially, than in some of the other movement modalities.
Mm-hmm. And
So,
then we
yeah,
alluded to this before, but just if you are dealing with pain, and this
yes,
wouldn't be for yoga teachers necessarily, unless you're also a licensed therapist from a medical
like,
context. But if you were dealing with pain, then that would be a good, potentially a good opportunity to deal with these finer, like
mm-hmm,
finer tuning things,
totally,
smaller aspects, smaller details, because you are trying to work around something that's bothering somebody. But you
totally.
can, there's a right, uh, right and wrong. There's a better and worse way to go about that. The worst way would be to say, well, you have to point your elbows this way when your hands are on the floor to protect your shoulder forever after. Like, this is just what you're going
Right.
to have to do, because it's going to save your shoulder, versus this is a temporary modification that we're making right now while your shoulder is sensitive, but you won't necessarily have to do it this way forever. And I think
Absolutely.
that's important from the person's sense of self, in terms of just knowing that it's temporary, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
modification that they're making right now, but it's not a right and wrong thing that they'll be forever destined to doing it that way.
100%. So if like a yoga student has shoulder pain when they do a specific pose in that moment, the yoga teacher, to me, it seems to help them modify to avoid that pain. Maybe that's within their scope. I feel like they're not like treating the pain, or it's not like a PT.
That's fair.
Yeah, just like in that moment, in that pose in my class, I want to help you so that you avoid the pain. Which
Yeah.
also, there's a whole other conversation about when is it okay to feel pain, and we're not going to get into that here. But just
No,
assume we
not
want that
now.
person to avoid the pain.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So the
then you
person,
can.
today my shoulder hurts when I do
Yeah,
chaturanga. What should I do, teacher? And then teacher
exactly.
will say, do this or that.
Try
But
a
that's,
wider.
yeah, it's different from, hey, my shoulder hurts. What can I do to rehabilitate it?
Exactly.
It's more working
Exactly.
around than trying to work. What
Yeah,
would be the
treat.
alternative?
Treat.
Yes, treat. That's it.
Right. So, in that sense, I think what we're trying to say is that's another example in which teaching in a detailed manner may be helpful when you're trying to help someone work around pain.
Yeah.
So maybe
Although
you
the
just,
go ahead.
so you might just guide them to try a few different alignments. And that's what we mean by detail. That's like, well, maybe for chaturanga, take your hands a couple inches wider. And that might seem like a small adjustment, but it's for this purpose of working around the pain, and that could potentially be
Yeah.
helpful. What were you
The
going to say?
interesting thing is that in a PT context, there, like back pain would be a good example of this, is that for a long time, maybe we've talked about this before, but for a long time, the micromanaging aspect of it was like the go-to treatment. Like, oh, you're this muscle, this multifidus or transverse
Mm-hmm.
abdominis isn't firing, and do this small detailed thing before you do any movement, or while you're doing a movement, or during all of your core exercises or whatever. And then more recently, I think we're coming to understand that, like, you don't have to be that, like, that's fine, and the person will probably get better, but you can also probably do it without doing all that. Or
Totally.
maybe you can just go for, like, do general exercise and not even focus on any of that stuff. Like okay, the one extreme would be, okay, we're going to activate the TA while we're doing core exercises, then a little bit
That
less
what's the TA?
transverse
And how do
abdominis,
you activate it?
drawing your navel in,
Navel to spine. Yeah.
navel to spine. So
Yeah.
then the next step back from that would be like, well, we're just going to do core exercises because we think the core is important for, core strength is important for back pain, but you don't need to worry about navel to spine. And then
Mm-hmm.
the step down further from that was be, well, we're just going to exercise. We're
Yeah,
just going
just
to move.
general.
And all of those things seem to help with back pain. So
Right. It
did
doesn't
you,
have to be so
yeah,
specific.
not to say that the specific stuff doesn't work, but did you really need it? And was the
Yep.
specific stuff actually the active ingredient in what helped the person get better? Or was it just they could have done anything because
Just
they were moving?
movement in
Yeah.
general.
And people who have only ever done the nitty gritty stuff will say it was the nitty gritty stuff. It was the
Right.
TA that was the problem. And I know because I've had so much success with that. And it's not to say that that doesn't work.
Right. But
But
is that the mechanism? Is that the reason?
yeah,
And
yeah.
do we even know at this point, like as far as what we know about what influences pain, like how to, when something, you do something and you feel better, like why did you feel better? I don't know that we even really have that drilled down yet. It's like so
Hmm.
complex, but I'm glad you're bringing this up because we need to very quickly go through our concrete examples.
Rapid
And
fire.
this was on our list, navel to
Yeah,
spine.
cool.
So
We can
yeah,
knock that one out.
yeah, exactly. So,
The reason for that is usually to protect the spine or either prevent back pain or cure back, treat and cure back pain. And
mhm.
that has helped people in the past, but it might not be necessary.
Right. And we're using that example of cueing navel to spine, which is very common in the yoga world, in the Pilates world, in the physical therapy world. And the idea is it's activating transverse abdominis, and you need that, like for all those reasons that you said. You and I are suggesting that the navel to spine cue is generally a micromanaging cue, right?
Yes.
It's not
Not
necessary. It
necessary.
overcomplicates movement.
Yeah.
It overrides the nervous system.
The body will create the stability that it needs for the task
Yeah.
somewhat
Naturally.
reflexively. Yeah. Naturally,
Reflexively, that's a
reflexively.
good word. Yeah.
And especially in a body weight yoga context. If we're talking
Totally.
about deadlifting, picking up a heavy weight off the floor, maybe there is some sort of strategy that you would want to do,
I
which
think
we would call bracing.
we talked about this in our core training episode. We
Right.
can refer people to that, and we'll put that link in the show notes
Right.
because it gets a little
So
more nuanced.
yeah, there's a bit to it, but the point being, there might be a situation where you might want to manage that, not
Hmm.
micromanage it necessarily, but manage it. But in a yoga context, maybe you don't need to manage it at all,
I don't think you
let alone
do.
micromanage it.
I can't see a reason why you would need to draw your navel to your spine, like as a just automatic thing we're always doing and teaching.
Yeah, for so
Okay,
many
so
reasons.
exactly. So just let's do a couple other of our ideas we wanted to talk about for making this a little more relevant. How about the cue that I think most of our listeners can relate to hearing? This is a cue in downward facing dog that's given so often. We lead people into down dog and then we tell them to externally rotate their shoulders, or we use other cues that make that happen, whether or not we say those exact words. We might say, roll, turn the eyes of the elbows to point forward, or wrap your triceps back, which is like, that's all effectively creating external rotation of the shoulder. So the
Does it
idea,
ever come from the hands, like corkscrew the hands into the ground?
that's a really good question. I find that it does not usually. I've seen that cue that you're giving or mentioning, like kind of more in the fitness realm. But in
Yeah,
yoga, it's
usually
usually,
that's for like a squat. So I was just wondering if you like,
oh,
they would say to create
yeah.
external rotation at the hip, corkscrew your feet into the ground prior to squatting or deadlifting. I was just wondering if that
That's a
was.
really good point. In yoga, it's usually taught like this outer inner spiral thing, where the upper arm is supposed to externally rotate, and then the lower arm
Oh,
is supposed to internally rotate
yeah.
because you're supposed to keep the inner hand down. Which
Ah,
you and I made a
that's
video
right.
about this actually.
Yeah. And that's different from the foot because the external rotation actually picks the, like, creates the arch, which is what you
Oh
want.
yeah,
But
that's so true.
so it's a
And
little different.
that's a really, and then a squat, your knees are bent. I don't know if that's because down dog the elbows are straight. I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes a
but this would
difference.
still be in this, like at the top.
No, it makes the arch and you want that like in a squat, but in downward
Hmm.
facing, yeah, that's so interesting. So
Well,
anyway,
traditionally they say you don't want the what's the word, the heel of the hand. Maybe that's not the word, but
the inner
you
ball
don't.
of the hand, like the base of
Yeah,
the index finger.
yeah, they say you don't want that to pick up, and then
Yeah.
I think that's unnecessarily
Yeah, that's a whole,
nitty
we
gritty.
could have put that on our list to talk about today. That's another micromanage thing that, yeah, yoga teachers will always say ground down through the base of your index finger, and that's really important. Maybe we're implying that it's not necessarily so important. And maybe another example of micromanaging, maybe the body self-organizes. And when you send more weight into the upper body, like if you come forward into plank from down dog, maybe you're naturally just going to ground down through that spot on the hand that sometimes we see lift in a downward facing dog, right?
Hmm.
Gosh, it's just funny because we didn't even plan to talk about that point, but you can just see how these micromanaging cues come up everywhere. We were going to talk about externally rotating the shoulder and down dog, but then that gets totally wrapped up into this ground the inner hand down. You kind of can't, they're not separate. But in
So
any case,
would there
yeah,
be a situation where you might like, well, okay, so what we're saying is that's not, you don't need to provide that cue from a safety standpoint. That's what we're,
that's right.
and that's why the cue is usually given. We're like wary of not externally rotating the shoulder is thought to be the safest position for the shoulder in that arms overhead position in down dog. And we are trying to avoid internal rotation because that's thought to be dangerous or
That's right.
provocative. And that's just not blanketly or uniformly the case for everybody. There could be certain people for whom that externally rotated position is more comfortable, and so for them it would be fine. But it's probably not necessary to apply that cue to every person in the room.
That's right. And some people may experience discomfort in their shoulder when externally rotated, and maybe they relieve that by internally rotating. And there's nothing wrong with that
Or at
inherently.
least, yeah, at least maybe not like maximally internally rotating, but just like allowing the shoulder to go into its natural, more neutral position.
Yeah, like not consciously overriding the rotation your nervous system would naturally make for you in down dog. I think it's kind of that idea. Like, let the body self-organize. We don't always have to layer on this cue of
Mm-hmm.
if people naturally come to down dog, they're generally not going to then layer on top of that this active external rotation. They don't like, it's like this layered on overriding cue. And I think we're suggesting that that's micromanaging and it's not necessary. And we can let people
Mm-hmm.
just let their shoulders do
But
their thing.
there might be some situations where it would be okay,
Hmm. Like we
such
said, all the
as
reasons that it could be helpful, that teaching in a detailed manner can be helpful in some
right.
ways.
So create some awareness. Like it's not it's it can be like what you were describing of the dissociation between the forearm and the upper arm
Yeah,
is like kind of an interesting movement exploration, and
totally.
it's a nice way to create some different tension through
Hmm.
the shoulder and into the rest of the arm. And again, if the person has pain in down dog, just when they do it naturally, well, let's
Hmm.
try externally rotating, let's try internally rotating, what feels better.
Or like in this video you and I made about down dog, and we'll put this link in the show notes. But when you feel a pain in your shoulder, if you do, you could also put your hands up on blocks. You could also try your hands wider. Like there are all these things you could try to work around feeling
Yeah,
discomfort in the
it's
shoulder.
not the only one.
Right. But there are so many possibilities. Yeah, so good examples of how like proposing and teaching little details and little shifts within a pose that can be done in a helpful way that's not a micromanaging way. What about? I'm thinking maybe we just could do one more of our examples.
Mm-hmm.
What about finding a neutral pelvis? What do you think about that one?
I laugh. I don't know what that means. What does that even mean?
I love that you're asking me what that means. Okay, well maybe I'll explain what I generally see happening in many yoga classes in terms of this micromanaging cue, which is that like teachers will have students come into mountain pose or tadasana where they're standing, and then they will have them. So everybody stands just the way they stand. We all have this natural, self-organized manner of standing. But then where the micromanaging often comes in is when we override all of that and we just do all these little detailed micromanaging adjustments, and the pelvis is a big area where that tends to happen. So the belief is that generally optimal alignment is in quote neutral pelvis, and that all too often we tend to either have a pelvis that's too far anteriorly tilted or too far posterior, like tucked under. So we need to readjust. We need to override how our nervous system is organizing us in order to reorganize back to neutral. And we like do that often in Tadasana, but then we try to keep that neutral pelvis as we move through the rest of our practice. Does that kind of make sense?
Nope. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I get
You're
it.
so funny.
I get it.
You get it.
But the funny thing to me is that like when people say neutral, what do they really mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because the
Mm-hmm.
natural average resting state for most people is a few degrees of anterior tilt. So what I am still trying to wrap my head around is that when people say neutral, are they saying, okay, we're trying to find this, we're busting out our protractor We're palpating your anterior superior iliac spine and your posterior superior iliac spine, and we're measuring to make sure that you're in 0 degrees of pelvic tilt in
Forward or
Tadasana,
back.
and then that you maintain that throughout the rest of
Yep.
your 60-minute, 75-minute practice. That's so,
Yeah.
first of all, that's out. Well, obviously nobody's busting out the protractor, but it's
That's the
outlandish to think
idea.
that it's outlandish to think that you could maintain that
Yeah.
0 degrees, because your pelvis just moves when you go into different poses, right?
Right.
In
Yeah.
fact, in a fitness context, we sort of talk a little bit about this too, this idea of finding neutral, and then maintaining neutral as we squat and as we deadlift. But as it turns out, there's
Mm-hmm.
research that shows that it's impossible to maintain neutral. Even if it looks to the naked eye like you're neutral,
Mm-hmm.
you're still going into lumbar flexion and posterior pelvic tilt as you descend into a squat or a hinge, or like a forward fold, maybe in the yoga context. So anyway, but my other point was, because normal natural resting posture is 7 or whatever, I don't know, maybe I made
Degrees.
that number up, but I
I think
think the number is
I
7.
remember that too.
A few degrees of anterior tilt is like the average or norm for the
Mm-hmm.
general population. So
Asymptomatic people too.
when we say neutral, is that actually what we mean? Because that's natural, or are we saying your normal, most people's normal of a few degrees of anterior pelvic tilt, they need to reverse that by lightly tucking the pelvis at all times throughout their yoga practice.
That
So I
is
just
my experience of it.
yeah. So I think it's fine. Okay, so we can explore our anterior tilt, we can explore our posterior tilt,
Yep.
and then we can come to somewhere in between. Like, yeah, we don't want to
Mm-hmm.
be overly
Yep.
arched. We don't want to be overly flattened. But this neutral is I think we need to consider it as a range and recognize
Yes.
that it's not one thing. It's not 0 degrees. It's definitely not 0 degrees. Probably it's probably more like a slight anterior tilt.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's okay to explore that, but it's not like, oh, well, now that we've found this at the beginning of class, we need to hold on to this plus or minus nothing, like
Right.
not allow it to
Yeah.
go forward or posteriorly tilt or anteriorly tilt, and keep that through the rest of our class. Because if we don't, we're gonna hurt our back, or we're gonna hurt something else, or there's
Absolutely.
going to be a natural disaster, or
That's
we're
so
going to
true.
like either in this moment, or we're going to pay for it later if we're out of neutral.
Yeah, totally. Those kinds of predictions are just rampant, I feel like, in my
Yeah.
observations in the yoga world. Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
so I think readjusting and quote organizing pelvic tilt is an example of micromanaging. But that doesn't mean, I think, just to our greater point in this episode, it doesn't mean that teaching with an awareness of the pelvis and maybe cueing pelvic tilt sometimes outside of this idea that you're controlling to optimize, but it's more just like you said for like feel a full anterior tilt, feel a full posterior tilt. What can you
Yeah.
find in the middle? Or sometimes you can change pelvic tilt in order to change again what tissues are being targeted in a certain movement. So if you're in
Yes.
a lunge, like say high lunge, yeah, let's say high lunge. If you're in high lunge and you want to stretch the hip flexors on the back leg, actually, let's say low lunge. Let's say the back knee is down. If you, it's very common when people come into that type of position, sometimes they do anteriorly tilt the pelvis. They tilt it forward. It's not bad, but that may bypass some of the hip flexor stretch you're looking for. So in that
That's
case, you
perfect.
might override and say, let's work a posterior tilt temporarily in this pose with the intention of stretching the hip flexors, right?
That's a perfect example. Yeah.
Right. So that's still detailed cueing and that's still teaching with detail. But it's about targeting tissue in a certain manner. It's not about like fixing, correcting.
Yeah. We're not trying to organize
Yeah,
into one perfect alignment or perfect posture, because there's no such thing. We're just saying, hey,
exactly.
try this. Oh, do
Right.
you feel more stretch through the down hip,
Right.
the front of the down hip? Great.
Like, whoa, isn't that cool? Look what you can feel in your body when you make this change.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that kind of encapsulates it and kind of summarizes, I think, what we're trying to say with this episode, which is that it's nuanced, right? But teaching in a detailed manner can be done in a way that's much more micromanaging and unnecessary and overcomplicates things. Or it can be done in a really intentional way where we're trying to have people learn and explore their bodies or target specific tissues. There are a lot of reasons why we might use those details.
Yeah. So and there are different contexts where each one is appropriate. Like I can think of a perfect example from a fitness context of a deadlift, which we mentioned earlier, picking up a weight off the floor. For somebody who's just starting out, it's really important not to give them too many cues because they could get paralyzed with the analysis of it. So like I had a mentor who all he would say would be butt back, chest up.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then
That's
like
it. That's
let
it.
the person go. And
Yeah.
that often, as long as they have the necessary mobility to,
Mm-hmm.
as long as they're put in a position where the height that they're lifting the thing from and the particular variation of the deadlift is matching their current abilities. If you put them in that position and then give them those two cues, oftentimes they can do a pretty nice job with it. I've also seen there's like I don't, this was years ago, but I stumbled across an article. It was like probably 1,000 words about how to deadlift. And actually we have a blog post about how to deadlift,
We
but
do.
it
We
wasn't
do.
that. Ours is good. This one was interesting, but it was talking about all of the fine-tuned things.
Right.
Um, feel your right big toe,
Yeah.
feel your left oblique, put your tongue on the roof of your mouth, um,
Right. That's a good
draw your
one.
chin in,
Mm-hmm.
how to breathe, where to direct the air. And like, I don't know, maybe there could be a situation where that is all. I mean, it was important to the person who wrote the article, and he obviously thought all of those details made for a better execution of the movement.
Mm-hmm.
But that level of analysis would be
Overwhelming.
counterproductive and overwhelming. Yeah.
Can't hold all that information in your head. Like movement is just, are you suggesting maybe
Yeah.
things could be simpler than they're often made to be?
Yeah. So he was purposely complicating it,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt overcomplicating it. And there are whole schools of thought, um, perhaps in the yoga world, certainly in the fitness world,
Mm-hmm.
that are they complicate things a lot. And I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if they're complicating it to sell something or complicating it to look smart and
Yeah.
seem like they have the secret to movement, or
Yeah.
if they're complicating it because it's really necessary to help people reach their goals. And I
That
think
I
it's
think
not.
those no, no. I think those are the pertinent questions to be asking. Like, yeah, where's the overcomplicating coming from? And I think in many cases it's those first two things you suggested. Probably not always that last
Unfortunately.
one.
Yeah.
Mhm. Because if you just teach things in a simple way, maybe you don't look as smart or as knowledgeable, but actually the irony is maybe you are smarter and more knowledgeable because you understand that
Yeah,
it
and I
doesn't have
bet
to be like
students
that.
would. I guess it would be different from student to student, but I bet that some students, like their favorite teachers, are the ones who can teach them the most simply or with the fewest complications. Like
Mhm.
I would imagine that that's some people's favorite experience. And again, there are
Absolutely.
probably some people who want it
Mhm.
to be complicated and want to get into those weeds. And if that is the case, then we just hope that if that's what is going on, that it's narrated around the more positive way that we have talked about approaching it.
Totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Used in that positive context rather than yeah, controlling potentially nocebo type context, things like that. I think that's a really, really excellent way to kind of wrap this all up and summarize the main takeaways from this conversation. But I really enjoyed getting to talk to you about this topic today. Um,
Same.
yeah, thanks for making so many great points and insights from your experience both in yoga, but also on the fitness side of things and the PT side, the physical therapy side of things as well. There's so much. I feel like we could talk about this for much longer, but we've got to wrap it up so this isn't so long.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to talk about it again
Oh,
in a
you're
couple
right.
episodes.
In a
So
couple episodes. And also a lot of these are themes that just tend to be woven through a lot of what we talk about. So we'll be coming back to this stuff for sure. But today was a really nice look at just that whole concept of micromanaging. And I hope that our listeners will have found it helpful and interesting. Thanks so much, Travis.
Thank you, Jenni.